Om Sarashavasamaramabham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmaracharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om. Be seated, please. Meshwara. Good. Very good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahayi Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma Vidvishavahayi. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. Welcome back. As you know, after completing all 18 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita, we're now doing an overview of those 18 chapters, and we're doing that using the English verses. We'll see that in just a few minutes, but we want to begin each of these classes with a portion of the Gita Dhyanam. Last week, we recited the first half of the Gita Dhyanam, and today we'll recite the second half of the Gita Dhyanam, and we'll continue that as we're going through the summary. We'll need the slides up. Thank you. All right. So we'll start here. This is the second half of the Gita Dhyanam. You can repeat after me. And as always, as I'm reciting, please glance at the translation so you know what we're reciting here. Bhishma Drona Tatha Jayadratha Jala Bhishma Drona Tatha Jayadratha Jaya Gandhara Nilotpala Gandhara Nilotpala Shalyagrahavati Kripena Vahani Shalyagrahavati Kripena Vahani Karnena Vela Kula Karnena Vela Kula Ashwathama Vikarna Ghora Makara Ashwathama Vikarna Ghora Makara Duryodhana Vartani Duryodhana Vartani Sotirna Kalu Pandava Rananadi Sotirna Kalu Pandava Rananadi Kaivartaka Keshavaha Kaivartaka Keshavaha Parasharyavachasaroja Mamalam Parasharyavachasarojam Gitartha Gandhotkatam Gitartha Gandhotkatam Nanakyanaka Kesaram Harikatha Nanakyanaka Kesaram Harikatha Sambodhana Bodhitam Sambodhana Bodhitam Loke Sajjana Shadpararaharaha Loke Sajjana Shadpararaharaha Pepiyamanam Muda Pepiyamanam Muda Bhuyad Bharata Pankajam Kalimala Bhuyad Bharata Pankajam Pradvamsina shreyase, Pradvamsina shreyase, Mukham karoti vachalam, Mukham karoti vachalam, Pangung langhayate girim, Pangung langhayate girim, Yat kripatamaham vande, Yat kripatamaham vande, Paramananda madhavam, Paramananda madhavam, Yam brahma varunendra rudra marutaha, Yam brahma varunendra rudra Stunvanti divyaistavaihi, Stunvanti divyaistavaihi, Vedai sangha parakramopanishadair, Vedai sangha parakramopanishadair, Gayantiyam samaga, Gayantiyam samaga, Dhyanavastita tadgatena manasa, Dhyanavastita tadgatena manasa, Pashyanti yam yoginaha, Pashyanti yam yoginaha, Yasyantam navidu sura suragana, Yasyantam navidu sura suragana, Devaya tasmai namaha, Devaya tasmai namaha. Very good. I forgot to welcome all of our online viewers and welcome all of you as we continue our overview and check. We're recording okay? No problem? Very good, thank you. We just redone our system. We have to check on things. So we will pick up where we left off. So in our previous class, we had reviewed all of chapter 1 and the opening portions of chapter 2. The very beginning of chapter 2, Arjuna and Krishna continue to have this little tug of war. Arjuna doesn't want to fight, and Sri Krishna insists, you must fight. And then beginning with verse 11, and that verse is significant because it's where the spiritual teachings of the Bhagavad Gita begins. In fact, Sri Shankaracharya, in his famous Bhashya, his commentary on this Bhagavad Gita, he doesn't begin his commentary until verse 11. So this is where Vedanta begins, and Sri Krishna begins with his very Vedantic solution to Arjuna's problem. Arjuna's problem, as we said last time, it's an emotional problem, but an emotional problem that crosses over into a fundamental problem because Arjuna is worried. Arjuna's problem is anticipating the death of so many of his beloved family members. And Sri Krishna's response is, "O Arjuna, there's nothing for you to grieve about because no one dies," and here's the important part, no one dies because no one was born in the first place. That's a message of Vedanta. There is no death because there's no birth. And of course, we're referring not to your body and mind, we're referring to your true inner nature consciousness. The consciousness that's present in your experience right this moment, that consciousness existed before your conception, before your birth, and will continue to exist after your death. So the first response of Sri Krishna is to assure Arjuna, there's nothing for you to grieve about because none of your family members will truly die. There is no such thing as death of that immortal, eternal truth of the individual being, that consciousness, Satchidananda Atma. Now, at this point, and that ended with his verse 25, that which is unmanifest, beyond all thoughts, unchanging, this is the nature, and the word soul is used here, but the reference is to Atma, Satchidananda, Atma. Therefore, knowing this to be so, you have no reason now to mourn. Now we take, Sri Krishna takes a different approach following this. Some of you remember we've had this discussion about adhikari bheda, different levels of understanding. So here, and this is woven in and through the Vedantic tradition, and that is there are different teachings for different people according to their ability to understand. So now Sri Krishna shifts gears, as we say in American English, to come to a easier to grasp level. Perhaps this is because he's not sure that Arjuna is ready to grasp this. That might be one reason Sri Krishna shifts gears. Another reason is Sri Krishna is teaching not just for Arjuna, but for all of us. So now the shift of gears, so to speak, is to change from this highest perspective. Arjuna, you need not grieve because no one dies, no one is born. That truth of every being is immortal, eternal, unchanging, as it says here. But now he takes a completely different perspective, referring not to Satchidananda Atma, but to the Sukshma Sharira, the subtle body. For beginning students of Bhagavad Gita, this is very tricky because the language leads you to get confused because first he's talking about Satchidananda Atma, and then he starts talking about the so-called traveling soul, the subtle body, that which exits your body at the time of death, travels on according to the laws of karma, and acquires a new body. That transition comes right between verses 25 and I guess it would be 26. By the way, you see that this is an abbreviated version that we're using for various reasons. So this shift takes place without an announcement. You know, if you remember in your school days, many textbooks have like headings, and the headings will tell you when a topic is changing. That's extremely helpful. You notice the Bhagavad Gita doesn't have these headings. It has chapter numbers and names, but we don't have headings. So that's my job, I suppose. So the new heading now is Sri Krishna is going to tell Arjuna, you need not grieve for a second reason. The second reason is that which dies gets reborn. Notice the first reason is nothing dies. Second reason, that which dies gets reborn. This doctrine of rebirth established by the doctrine of karma. And then there's going to be a third reason. I'll stop at that point and we'll see that at that time. Okay, we will continue our recitation. Maybe just to help us get started, for the first verse you can listen and repeat, and then for the following verses we'll recite together. You remember that we recite these English verses in the same meter as the original Sanskrit. Listen. Excuse me. Death is certain for all those born. Death is certain for all those born. Birth is certain for all who die. Birth is certain for all who die. Since this is inevitable, since this is inevitable, you have no reason now to mourn. You have no reason now to mourn. Together. Also with your dharma in view, you should remain unwavering, because for warriors nothing is worthier than a righteous war. But if you now refuse to fight in this battle most virtuous, you will forfeit dharma and fame by committing this grievous sin. Just a quick comment to keep you oriented here. The reference now is not just to the subtle bodies of the warriors who will die in a battlefield, but for Arjuna too. What will happen to his subtle body after the battle? And the point is, if he fails to fight the war, he commits sin, and his subtle body will go to presumably a lower birth. If he follows dharma, by remaining on the battlefield, presumably the subtle body goes to a better birth. Also, there's also a transition to the third reason. Let me give you the third reason now. So first reason, Arjuna should let me put it in different terms. The first strategy Sri Krishna uses to convince Arjuna to fight, the first strategy is to tell Arjuna no one dies. Second strategy, anyone who dies gets reborn. Now we're seeing a third strategy. Shame. And it's very interesting. I wonder, this is just a stray thought, Mahatma Gandhi was very effective in using shame as a weapon against the British, right? If you understand his approach to winning India's freedom, a technique, a strategy he used frequently was to shame the Brits into leaving. And perhaps the origin of his strategy can be seen in these verses. So we could also take this as one more step down in terms of adhikaditvam. So at the highest level, no one dies. At the middle level, anyone who dies gets reborn. And at the third level, and besides, this will bring shame upon you. Arjuna will continue. Great warriors will despise your name, thinking you yielded due to fear. Your enemies with vicious words will degrade you, a dreadful shame. If you die, heaven you will gain. If you win, the kingdom is yours. Therefore stand up, O Arjuna, and be resolved to fight the war. Thus, actually, I'm going to stop here because now we have another heading. And again, this is slightly abbreviated, so we're skipping some verses. And this is the place where Karma Yoga is first introduced in the Bhagavad Gita with this very verse. It's an introduction. Karma Yoga, the teaching of Karma Yoga doesn't come till verse 47, but now we get some introduction to Karma Yoga. Note what a prevalent topic it is. It comes first in chapter 2. Chapter 3 is entitled Karma Yoga. Chapters 4 and 5 deal largely with Karma Yoga, and then it comes back in chapter 18. So definitely a central topic of the Bhagavad Gita. The introduction, though, is a little unexpected, and it has to do with how do you understand Karma Yoga? Now, in modern times, none of you will make a mistake about it, but in this ancient time, 2,000 years ago, when these verses were being composed by Vyasa, there was an issue with that word karma yoga, because the word karma in a religious context means rituals. Yeah? The word karma in a religious context means the performance of rituals. Vaidika karma, the rituals prescribed in the Vedas. And before Sri Krishna describes what karma yoga is, his introduction tells you what karma yoga is not. And specifically, karma yoga is not the performance of rituals. And you've noticed several places in the Bhagavad Gita where Sri Krishna is highly critical of performing rituals, the excessive ritualism. He's not critical of devotion. So to do rituals of devotion, like the brief arati we do at the end of the class, that kind of ritual is a ritual expressing devotion. What Sri Krishna is going to criticize here and elsewhere in the Bhagavad Gita is not devotional rituals, but rather rituals done for the sake of achieving specific goals. For example, in ancient times, there were rituals you might do for the sake of getting the birth of a son. There were rituals you might do so that your crops would be better in the next year, that the rains would come. There are a great number of rituals that were done for specific worldly goals and otherworldly goals, which means you do rituals for the sake of going to heaven. And those, let's be honest, those are not acts of devotion. If you're doing a ritual because you want your crops to do better, where's the devotion in that? That is a ritual done for us. It's a very, very, No, I'm not sure this works. Capitalistic idea. You invest your effort in rituals and you reap the results of your investment. How is that? And some of you will also remember that I've called this spiritual materialism. You're using spiritual means for worldly ends. So all of that, keep it in mind as you recite this introduction where Sri Krishna criticizes ritualism as not being karma yoga. Thus far of wisdom I have spoke, of karma yoga listen now, practicing which you shall be freed from the bondage of all your deeds. Those who seek but pleasure and power, attached to Vedic rituals, obsessed with heavenly rewards, their hearts will never be at peace. Like a pond in a mighty flood, water surrounding everywhere, such is the worth of Vedic rites for one who knows the highest truth. And there's more here. We've skipped some verses, but this is Sri Krishna's criticism before he explains what karma yoga is. Now, in the prior classes, we've discussed how karma yoga is a whole body of teachings. It's not just one simple thing. So it's significant how Sri Krishna begins his teaching of karma yoga. As I said, it begins here and then continues in chapters 3, 4, and 5. Huge topic. But the way he begins is with this verse, perhaps the most widely quoted verse from the Bhagavad Gita, Karmanyeva adhikaraste ma paleshu kadachana. You, O Arjuna, and most quoted and most mistranslated verse in the Bhagavad Gita due to a Hindi interpretation of the word adhikara. So when somebody says, "Ye mera adhikar hai," you get the idea from all these silly Bollywood movies. So there, it most certainly means right. This is my right. This is not a Hindi movie script, nor is it Hindi. It's Sanskrit. So we have to get the correct meaning of adhikara as a Sanskrit word in this context. And in this context, that word adhikara means scope, and I can't really find a one-word translation for it in English. Good expressions would be scope of authority. The area over which you have authority, the area over which you have control, your range of control. That's another good expression. Adhikara here means range of control. So Sri Krishna begins his discussion about karma yoga by telling Arjuna, Arjuna, you have control, adhikara, over your actions. The actions you commit fall within the range of your control, but the results of those actions do not fall in the range of your control. To use other words, the actions are in our hands, the results are in Ishvara's hands. This is the beginning of the teachings of Karma Yoga with that karmanyevadhikaras. Not only is it mistranslated, but many times when you read these, you see different kinds of plaques and different artistic representations of this verse. I'm embarrassed by how often it's actually misspelled. This verse gets misspelled in varieties of ways. That's embarrassing to misspell this famous verse. Anyway, I'm just going off on a tangent here. Let's come back to Sri Krishna's teachings on Karma Yoga. Actions alone you can control, but their results you cannot choose. Be not the author of the fruits, yet to inaction be not drawn. Give up attachment to results. Act instead with this attitude. Treat success and failure alike. Yoga is equanimity. Lowly are those who think themselves to be the authors of the fruits. Arjuna, you should seek support in Karma Yoga's principles. By this yoga the wise renounce attachment to their works' results. Freed from the bondage of rebirth, they reach the state beyond all grief. This topic of Karma Yoga is huge. I just want to remind you of one central principle that often gets overlooked, and that is Karma Yoga begins with the recognition, in fact, that was the earlier part, the introduction. Karma Yoga begins with the recognition that your actions cannot produce lasting contentment and perfect peace. That's the beginning point of Karma Yoga. And you can see that here, attachment. The wise renounce attachment to their works' results. This principle, recognizing the limitations of worldly efforts, that's a crucial part of Karma Yoga that's often overlooked. We could spend hours, of course, talking about Karma Yoga. That's not our purpose here. We want to continue our overview now. Now, I think 2 verses back, is that here? No, it's not here. So, in a prior verse, Sri Krishna used the term sthita. They are firm in their wisdom. Sri Krishna used that term before. One whose wisdom is firm. In Sanskrit, sthita prajna. And Arjuna caught that word, and he's really curious. What is one who is stita prajna, one whose wisdom is firm. What is the nature of an enlightened person? And Arjuna's question is kind of surprising. He said, how do they speak? In Sanskrit? How do they sit and move about without touching the ground? The point I'm making here is Arjuna has, like many people, has some unrealistic concepts about the nature of an enlightened person. So, and that's not uncommon. If Arjuna has this question, that means you and many other people will have that question. What does it really mean to be enlightened? And Sri Krishna's response is spot on, as our British friends say. So let's see this portion. Arjuna said, O Krishna, please describe to me the nature of enlightened ones. How do the steady-minded speak? How do they sit and move about? The blessed Lord said, O Arjuna, when they forsake all cravings born of their own minds, content in themselves with the self, such are they whose wisdom is firm. Let me just give you a little orientation here so the next verses are more meaningful. The point that Sri Krishna is making here is this. When you discover your own innate fullness and completeness, you recognize that your contentment is not dependent on anything outside of you. This is a central teaching of Vedanta. So this is the point of view that Sri Krishna adopts here. He says, when you discover, when the stita prajna, when this wise person discovers their innate fullness and completeness, there is no dependency on anything outside for the sake of contentment. Or to use language we've used before, raga and dvesha disappear. The compulsions to chase after what you want, to run away from what you don't want, that compulsivity disappears for the wise person. Let's continue. With minds untroubled by distress, free from thirst for the world's delights, having no cravings, fear, or rage, such are they whose wisdom is firm, rejoicing not in pleasant times, nor detesting adversity, free from every attachment here. Such are they whose wisdom is firm, as a tortoise withdraws its limbs. All their senses are drawn away from the objects that they perceive. Such are they whose wisdom is firm, even for those of wisdom vast, who strive to practice self-control. Their minds can be carried away by the senses so turbulent. There's an important point to be made here. And that is, enlightenment is not a matter of self-control. Who strive to practice self-control. Many people think, oh, I have to practice being a good Hindu, whatever that means, by following dharma, by avoiding adharma, by resisting raga and dvesha. I have to do all of that. It's a wonderful feeling, but it doesn't work. Self-control works to a point, right? We all know this. We all have a power of self-control, willpower. Unfortunately, it has some limitations. For example, when you want to eat less food, so you lose some weight, you have self-control, but what is the degree over which you can control your behavior? To some extent, but certainly not completely. It's impossible to completely control the behavior of our bodies. It's impossible to completely control the nature of our minds. What? Can you control your mind completely? For the next 2 seconds, don't think of an elephant. Look at that. You can't even control your mind for 2 seconds. You get my point. The mind is what it is. The body is what it is. Any solution to worldly suffering that depends on self-control is doomed to failure. Fortunately, what Sri Krishna is teaching here is not self-control. Self-control is important, don't get me wrong. We need that self-control for the sake of gaining spiritual wisdom. And it's that spiritual wisdom that is the solution, not self-control. So we need some self-control to gain that spiritual wisdom, and when you gain that spiritual wisdom, self-control is not an issue. Anyway, with that in mind, we can see the problem of those who try to use self-control. There are always weaknesses in that self-control, and you'll see the consequences of those weaknesses, and you'll see in the coming verses, I think you'll see 2 things. The weakness of self-control and the benefits of spiritual wisdom. Let's see that now. Dwelling on objects in the world, to them attachment does arise. From attachment desire stems forth. From desiring does anger spring. From such anger delusion comes. In delusion values are lost. Then reasoning gets overwhelmed. Finally the person is lost. But those remaining self-controlled, even when senses clamor strong, free from cravings, despising not, they attain great tranquility due to wisdom. Continue. Just as wind carries boats astray, senses can lead wisdom away. Therefore, those whose wisdom is firm restrain their senses constantly. That last line sounds like it means you have to restrain your senses. But that's not what Sri Krishna means here. It means when you have discovered how full and complete you are and how your innate contentment doesn't depend on anything, then when you see that container of ice cream in the freezer, which would normally pull your senses, if you recognize that you are okay without the ice cream, the senses lose their power to drag you about. That's the point of this last word, of this last line. And with that, chapter 2 comes to an end. Chapter 2, Sankhya Yoga. Remember the meaning Sankhya here means spiritual wisdom. And it brings us to chapter 3. Chapter 3, as you already know, is Karma Yoga. And we'll see chapter 3 here. Together, Arjuna said, if you think wisdom does excel better than acting on desires, O Krishna, why then urge me now to take part in this awful war? Your words seem confusing to me. They appear contradictory. Tell me truly the path for me, by which I gain the commonest good. So Arjuna is confused here for a good reason. So first Sri Krishna says, get up and fight. And then he says, no one dies. How do you reconcile those two statements? If no one dies, what's the purpose of fighting? Right? If no one dies, what's the purpose of fighting? So Arjuna is naturally confused. In a prior chapter, Sri Krishna gave this profound spiritual wisdom, which doesn't seem to fit with the message, fulfill your dharma. So naturally, Arjuna says, well, which do you mean? I'm confused. And this is a common confusion for almost all students of Advaita Vedanta, and that is, we fail to discern that these teachings operate at two levels, so to speak, at an absolute level and at a relative level. At an absolute level, there is no death, there is no birth, there is no individual, there is only one non-dual reality we call Brahman. That's at the highest level. And that when Sri Krishna gave his opening teaching, starting at verse 11, he was speaking from that highest level. No one dies. But then, notice, he shifted gears, as we said, and he speaks from a worldly level. The technical terms we use for this is paramartika, absolute reality, and vyavaharika, relative, empirical reality. Vedanta necessarily teaches at both levels. So at this worldly level, Sri Krishna tells Arjuna, fulfill your duty, fight the war. Why? If Arjuna, look at the connection between the two. If Arjuna fails to fulfill his duties and fight the war, he has no chance at all of having a mind that is purified enough to reach this highest knowledge. So karma yoga and following dharma in general is a necessary precondition for gaining enlightenment. We've had this discussion many times before. But here Arjuna is confused because these two teachings, no one dies, fight the war. These two seem incompatible to Arjuna, so Sri Krishna has to. I'm smiling. I have an interesting memory. When I was a student during the 3-year course that Pujya Swamiji taught in his Pennsylvania ashram, he would frequently, just like Sri Krishna, switches between this highest standpoint and an empirical, worldly standpoint. He kept going back and forth in classes. It got very confusing for us students early on. Later on, we were okay. But early on, it was a little tricky, even as it can be tricky here. So I had a funny thought. We were talking to some students and we were just talking silliness. So in the silliness, I suggested this. What we should do is fix up on the dais where Pujya Swamiji would sit. We should have 2 light bulbs, one red and one blue. And when he's talking from the highest standpoint, the red light should be illumined. And when he's talking from a relative standpoint, the blue light should be illumined. I'm just pointing this out to show that this is a common confusion. We have to understand at which level these teachings are being taught. So this is Arjuna's confusion, and we'll see how Sri Krishna responds. Together? The blessed Lord said, in this world there are but 2 paths, declared by me so long ago. Wisdom for the contemplative, karma yoga for active ones. And here we have to pause again, because there's a huge discussion that goes along with this verse we'll mention very briefly. And that is, there are some people who dedicate themselves exclusively to gaining that highest knowledge. Such people are usually, but not always, sannyasis. You need not become a sannyasi to do so, but conventionally, such people renounce worldly activities and exclusively dedicate themselves to reaching that highest knowledge. And that is the first path, the path of wisdom for the contemplative. But suppose you're not ready to give up all those worldly pleasures. Having a family, going to movies, watching TV, etc., normal dharmic pleasures. If you're not ready to give up all that, fine. You need not dedicate yourself to seeking that highest wisdom and renouncing all worldly pleasures. You have the option of karma yoga. Notice that, and this is an important point, I'll make it very briefly, and that is, this does not create a boundary between jnana yoga and karma yoga. Many people misinterpret this verse. You are either a jnana yogi, pursuing the path of knowledge, or you are a karma yogi, engaged in worldly activities and seeking enlightenment through your worldly activities. This division is not at all what Sri Krishna means here. Now, from our earlier classes, you've heard me say again and again and again, these distinctions between the four yogas are arbitrary. They are all meant, karma yoga, bhakti yoga, dhyana yoga, and jnana yoga, all of these are meant to be pursued in parallel by everyone. So this arbitrary distinction, you take this path or that path, is not in keeping with the teachings. What Sri Krishna is referring here, what he is referring to here is two different lifestyles. The word path here. There's a lifestyle of a sannyasi, someone who renounces worldly activities. There's a lifestyle of a karma yogi, one who does not renounce worldly activities. That's what Sri Krishna is referring to here. And remember, we saw in chapter 1, Arjuna at one point considered, or it was the beginning of chapter 2, Arjuna at one point considered becoming a sannyasi when he suggested that he would go and live on alms. So this is a conflict for Arjuna, and Sri Krishna addresses that there are not two yogas, there are two lifestyles. The lifestyle of a renunciate and lifestyle of a karma yogi. And now he's going to go on Sri Krishna is quite analytic here. He shows problems of those who renounce partially. He actually calls it hypocritical. So let's look at what someone who wants to gain spiritual wisdom, but they're not quite ready to give up all worldly pleasures. He addresses those people in the following verses. Excuse me. Together. Those who withdraw from worldly acts, yet continue to dwell upon all the pleasures they once enjoyed. Deluded they live in deceit, but those whose senses are controlled, who work remaining unattached, practicing karma yoga thus, such as they are to be extolled, fulfill your duties as obliged. Deeds are better than idleness. Give up attachment, do your work as a ritual sacrifice. By sacrifice the gods are pleased. When pleased, the gods will strengthen you, serving each other in this way. You shall obtain the highest good, but those who offer not their gifts, yet enjoy what the gods do grant, they are but thieves incurring sin, acting for their own sakes again. here we're getting yet another aspect of karma yoga. An aspect of karma yoga in which you recognize that, as we saw in chapter 2, verse 47, you are in control of your results, the results of your actions. You have no control. You are in control of your actions. You have no control over your results. And here he takes it a step further. Again, we can spend hours talking about karma yoga, but there's an important teaching here. One of many aspects of karma yoga is this: the capacity you have to act. For example, your intelligence, your physical strength, your dexterity, your abilities, whatever they may be, those abilities are given. We develop them, fine, but we're given an intellect. If you were not given an intellect, what could you accomplish? To fail to acknowledge that the skills, the abilities that we have, all depend on the blessings we received at birth. To fail to acknowledge that is, can I say, anti-karma yoga? Does that make sense? So what Sri Krishna is talking about here, in a little symbolic way with reference to ancient rituals, he's saying that we must, and as followers of karma yoga, we must acknowledge the fact that our abilities and skills, even though we develop them, in their root, those skills and abilities are God-given, which means we should acknowledge the source and be grateful. Continuing with karma yoga. All your duties you must perform without attachment to the fruits. Work instead for the good of all. Great people gain perfection thus. Many are they who emulate the actions of the wisest ones. So you should labor unattached, working for the sake of the world. All works are done according to one's natural abilities. Yet when ego deludes the mind, one thinks, I did it, I am great. But the wise know all actions are based on God-given qualities. Actions depend upon nature. Thinking thus they are not attached. Even the wise ones will behave according to their temperaments. To nature creatures all conform. Their traits can never be repressed. Likes and dislikes can both arise toward the objects that we perceive. Be not influenced by these two. They indeed are your enemies. Enemies. And this is a good place to stop. We'll pick it up here next class. Enemies. What is the biggest enemy you faced in life? And this is what we're going to see. You can see, what is it that drives people to commit a sin even against their own desires? The biggest enemy we face in life, and you know the answer to this very well, the biggest enemy, actually two of them. We call them Mr. Raga and Mr. Dvesha. Remember, we said Raga, Dvesha, the word likes and dislikes are here, but better to understand them as compulsions. The compulsion to chase after what you want, the compulsion to run away from what you don't want. Lives are destroyed by those compulsions. Is it not so? Think about it just for a moment. this compulsivity and impulsivity are not far apart. Impulsivity means without thinking, you do something. In fact, interesting. What's the difference between impulsivity and compulsivity? Impulsivity means without thinking, you do it. Compulsivity means even though you think, you do it anyway. Right? Think of impulsivity. Think of things you have done impulsively and how much trouble you got into as a result. That's because you act without. I still remember was it my mother? Think before you do anything. Think before you do anything. You've heard this from your parents also. So that's especially for a young person and especially for a teenager. That's an important message because young people and teenagers can be very impulsive. Act first, think later. Not uncommon. And we understand the consequences of that impulsive behavior. But here we're not talking about impulsive behavior, we're talking about compulsive behavior. Compulsive behavior is different because you think first and you think, oh, I shouldn't do that. And then you do it anyway. Why? Mr. Raga and Mr. Dvesha are like two, we've called them bosses inside. These are the enemies. The enemies inside who compel you to chase after certain things you want, even though you know it's adharmic. Right? And Dvesha is an enemy inside that compels you to avoid things, even though it's adharmic to avoid things, even though you know it's adharmic to avoid things. So this is the next topic we see here in chapter 3, the problem of raga, dvesha. And Sri Krishna uses the term kama, desire. And we'll see that when we meet next time. A couple of quick announcements. Tomorrow, satsang at 6 p.m. We've been meeting outside. The weather should be nice tomorrow. Very pleasant. Come and join us for satsang in the picnic area tomorrow at 6. And then I mentioned earlier that Janmashtami comes in the middle of the following week on September 6th. Next Saturday is September 2nd. We will have a very low-key celebration of Janmashtami on that day. And by low-key celebration, I mean that our 10 o'clock meditation session will begin with a simple Krishna Puja, short, and then that Krishna Puja will be followed by a meditation on Sri Krishna. So by some simple puja and meditation, we will celebrate Krishna Janmashtami together. Bhagavad Gita class will continue as normal. And we'll conclude with our brief prayers. Here you go. Om Gananahan Tva Ganapatigam Avamahe Kaving Gavinam Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspatahana Shrinvan Uttavasida Sadhanam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururhatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsa Chanuramardhanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadguru. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Hamritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.